Next, we will have our second talk by Manuel Brenner and his colleague from the Central Institute of Mental Health in Mannheim. Manuel, did you have, who was the colleague that you needed to have pulled out of the audience?
He's actually sick, so I'm doing it on my own, so no worries.
Great, okay, excellent. So it'll just be Manuel then. His talk is titled Fast and Scalable Learning of Generative Models for Chaotic Dynamical Systems and Neural Data.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Adam. Today I will be talking a bit about a current project I'm carrying out with Leonard Bereska, Po-Chen Kuo from Taiwan, myself, and the research group of Daniel Dustewitz at the Central Institute of Mental Health in Mannheim. We are also part of Heidelberg University. And just to give a short illustration, just to give a short motivation of why we do what we do. So there's this general hypothesis that cognitive functions are implemented in terms of network dynamics in the brain, so that the dynamics are actually really crucial for implementing function and shaping our emotional and cognitive experience. And because we are part of a mental health institution, it's also crucial for us to understand what happens when this cognitive and emotional experience is disturbed in some kind of way by changes in network dynamics. So you have distractibility in ADHD, you have obsessions in obsessive compulsive disorders, hallucinations in schizophrenia. And so the general hypothesis is that these changes in network dynamics can actually be caused by a lot of biophysical and structural causes. So changes in dopamine concentration, in synaptic connectivity, for example. So it's really crucial if you want to build a causal model of what's going on during mental illness and in the brain from a dynamical systems perspective, you need to understand what's going on in terms of the dynamics. What we are doing is we are inferring generative models from data. This data can look many different ways. It can be just simple benchmark dynamical systems data, as we will see later, or it can be experimental data that is in some way pre-processed before we plug it into our model. The next step is to actually infer the model by showing it the data. And after we have inferred the model, we can just completely throw away the data in principle and generate completely new samples, as we will see later. And we can then try to compare these completely new samples with the data distribution and assess the deviation in terms of a KLX measure or as mean squared error, for example, as I will also show in more detail later. The model we are using more concretely is called a piecewise linear recurrent neural network. This is a state space model that's composed of two main parts, the latent model and the observation model. And the latent model is really the heart of what we are trying to learn and achieve, because the latent model is kind of hiding behind the data surface, but this is where the dynamics are actually going on. And in our case, we have just these latent states, which you can also kind of imagine as units like in a neural network, so kind of synapses or neurons that are firing or have a certain kind of activity and are connected to each other with these diagonal and off-diagonal couplings. And what's important here is that we have a piecewise linear structure, so we have a non-linearity in the form of a ReLU activation function, and then we can connect the latent dynamics to an observation, to data through this observation model. This can be a simple Gaussian observation model, as in this case, or it can also be for fMRI data, something like a hemodynamic response function. If you want to take a look, that's already implemented, and this paper by George Jacobe and also from our research group. So our main question that I will be talking for the rest of this talk about is how can we increase computational capacity of this simple piecewise linear state space model, and by increasing the computational capacity, achieve some kind of dimensionality reduction of latent space while retaining this piecewise linear form. And you can think of it in terms of a neurophysiological analogy, in terms of, for example, dendritic computation. In every single neuron, there's also computation going on in the dendrites, and there's, if you increase the complexity of the synapses and of the neurons, you can achieve some kind of diversity and more computational capacity. And we achieve this by introducing this basis expansion. So we replace the simple ReLU activation function that just gives us a maximum of 0 and the latent activation by this base expansion, which introduces a bias vector and a scaling factor alpha. So we can pick the number of basis states here. It's a hyperparameter that we can choose, and this introduces more parameters into the model while retaining the latent dimensionality, and so makes the model more expressive and colorful. The method we are using to actually learn our model is called variational inference. That's pretty popular right now in a lot of machine learning environments. So the basic idea is always the same. We have this variational lower bound that we are trying to optimize by introducing this approximate posterior distribution over latent states, which is this Q that we are not computing explicitly, but we are approximating from the data. So in our case, we are also doing a mean field approximation. So for every density at time step t, we are just estimating it straight from the data at time point t by parameterizing a Gaussian distribution with a multi-layer perceptron, so a neural network. And just as a general note, we can also, in principle, use different algorithms to learn these piecewise linear recurrent neural networks, like expectation maximization, for example. But the advantage of this method is that it scales really well computationally, and we can have a high number of latent states while having a really fast and amortized inference of our models, which is especially helpful for if we take a look at real neural data like EEG recordings that have a high number of input states and therefore also and potentially a high number of latent states. So first of all, we tried this out on benchmark dynamical systems like the Lorentz attractor with this famous butterfly shape, and also the Lorentz 96 system. The Lorentz 96 system is it doesn't have a fixed dimensionality as the Lorentz does with 3D. But the Lorentz 96 is recursively defined, so you can in principle also have, in our case, we trained on 10-dimensional Lorentz systems, but you can also have 20 dimensions, 50 dimensions, which makes it really useful to understand. And both of them are chaotic dynamical systems, so they have these typical chaotic properties that we already heard about in the first talk. What we are using to evaluate how well our reconstructions actually are, that we learn from the data, we are using both global and local metrics. The first one is a Kullback-Leibler divergence that compares the distributions in state space and in observation space of our trajectories. So in our case, you can imagine just a Lorentz system that is the underlying true system, and then we learn a completely generative model and just generate a completely new trajectory based on our model, and we can compare the two. And for chaotic dynamical systems, this is really crucial because mean squared error predictions quickly diverge because you have small changes in initial states that can blow up quickly, and then you are really not matching the underlying dynamics, the underlying data well, while you still have captured the underlying system properly. So we tried this out on the Lorentz system and could actually show that having this base expansion, so this number of parameters of bases really improves pretty dramatically the reconstruction. So for the KLX, and both in state space and in observation space, and the mean squared error predictions 1, 5, and 25 time steps ahead. So you can see here that the number of latent states usually improves reconstruction, but by introducing the spaces, we can achieve an effective dimensionality reduction, because if you have 10 bases or 5 bases, you really achieve these better KL results and better mean squared error results much faster, and thereby you don't need 12 latent states, for example, to learn the Lorentz system, but you can achieve the same result with 8 latent states. And effectively, for 12 latent states, you still have a substantial improvement in the quality of your reconstruction. And we could achieve the same thing for the Lorentz 96 system. So if we just have 20 latent states and 1 basis, we tend to find this, be able to generate these trajectories that kind of seem to capture the right timescales that are present in the data, but only provide these simpler oscillatory patterns. So these are contour plots where the color just gives you the value of the trajectory. And as we can see in the case with 20 base pairs, we really achieve this kind of chaotic behavior. And if you look more closely here, we really have, especially in the beginning, we closely trace the system, but then at some point it diverges, which is not surprising because it's a chaotic dynamical system, but we have, in terms of both the KLC measure and the 25 steps ahead prediction mean squared error, we have really good results. So how to read this plot? From left to right, we can see the number of base pairs that we introduced, and this is a number of latent states. So just as you can see, for 15 latent states, we weren't able to really properly learn the system, but starting from 20, 25, and 30 latent states, you can see that we both really managed to reconstruct the system, and that introducing these base pairs substantially increased the quality of the reconstruction and made reconstruction much more consistent. So with 50 base pairs, every single of one of the reconstructions is actually has a very small KLZ value, which means that the reconstruction is really close to the underlying data distribution, and the mean squared error 25 steps is also much better than just what you would expect from just randomly guessing the system. We are now also moving towards experimental results and experimental data sets. This is an example where we took a look at intracranial EEG recordings, so from the human brain, that were doing a visual spatial working memory task. And there are some problems that we face with real data that we usually don't face with these benchmark dynamical systems. For example, we don't really know the underlying attractor dimensionality, and we also don't, there's potentially noise, and we don't really know how high dimensional the system that's generating this data actually is. Because in the case of the Lawrence, it's only 3 dimensions. In the Lawrence 96, it was 10 dimensions, but for EEG, we really don't know. And considering that, we could also, with the help of the base expansion, achieve some at least qualitative reconstructions of these trajectories. And now we are also taking a look at multiple single unit data from a rat brain. And just to wrap this up, we introduced this method to our PLRNN model that's called base expansion. We could show that it actively improves inference, and it encourages, in the case of the Lawrence 96, the learning of more interesting chaotic dynamics and the reconstruction of these dynamics. And it also allows us to effectively reduce the dimensionality of the latent space, which can help us with interpretability and just computational scaling, and also reduces parameters we need for the model. Just as acknowledgements, we were funded by the German Science Foundation and by the Excellence Cluster Structures at Heidelberg University. So thanks for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Manuel. That was a really interesting talk and super clear. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
We've got several questions in the Q&A. Jules Brichard asks, after being fitted to a data from a complex system, are your networks chaotic systems themselves?
Yeah, you could understand it that way, because we are learning this piecewise linear recurrent neural network. And if we have an initial state, we can generate dynamics with the system, because we have this recursive map that shows us when we have a C0 state, we can move to C1, C2, and then generate a completely new time series. And that time series in itself is then a chaotic dynamical system. So yes.
Great. So Pierre Orhan asks, what is the exact definition for KL divergence of the model and simulated trajectories here?
So what we are doing is basically we are binning, in this case, the space, and just compare the density of the points, so the probability of the model to be in that region of the space with the probability of the simulated trajectory. So we just take a trajectory that's like 10,000 time points long, and then we generate one completely freely from the model that's also 10,000 time points long, and then we just compare the probabilities of them being in every bin of this point of this space, and then that gives us a value that can be, if it's close to 0, that means we have a strong match, and if it's large, that means we basically don't have any overlap.
Makes sense there. If Pierre, if you have any more technical questions, you can post them in the chat. And then we have one more question from Ranek. He says, they say, thank you for the talk, Manuel. How similar or dissimilar is this method compared to David Cicillo's LFAD's algorithm? And then this needs to be a short answer because then we have to move on to Matthew.
Unfortunately, I don't know that algorithm in any details, so I can't answer that. Sorry.
Okay. So you can pick that up in the chat. Also, there's a request for paper references in the chat too.
Oh, yeah.
So thank you again, Manuel. That was a great talk.
Thank you.
And we'll move on to our final talk of the session from